On March 3, 1999, at the Arizona State Prison death row, inmate Walter LaGrand, a German citizen, took his final breaths in the gas chamber, closing the final chapter on his sentence for the brutal bank robbery and murder of employee Kenneth Hartsock 17 years prior. This execution was not just a punishment for a crime. It also ignited a shocking diplomatic crisis between two NATO allies, Germany and the United States. Before facing death, what was LaGrand's last meal, and what were his final words? Join us as we explore. The story of Walter LaGrand is a journey from an immigrant child to an internationally controversial death row inmate with a death that shook the political foundations of two continents. The content contains elements of violence and true crime. Viewer discretion is advised. On a cold winter day in 1982, two German brothers walked into a bank in the small town of Marana, Arizona, with a simple plan for a robbery. But in just a few minutes, everything turned into a tragedy. Walter LaGrand, 20, along with his brother Carl, 19, turned a robbery into a homicide when they stabbed 63-year-old bank employee Kenneth Hartsock to death with 24 ruthless cuts from a box cutter. Kenneth Hartsock had pleaded for his life, but one of the brothers said twice, "Just make sure he's dead." This detail would become critically important during the trial and would influence the court's final decision. At the same time, Don Lopez, 20, was also stabbed multiple times and miraculously survived to become a key witness. Kenneth Hartsock was not just a simple bank employee. He was a father, a husband, and the pillar of his family. Every morning he arrived at the bank at 7 a.m., always greeting customers with a friendly hello. He had worked at this bank since 1960, witnessing the town of Marana grow from a small village into a bustling community. Meanwhile, during the late 1970s, Walter LaGrand was going through a troubled adolescence. Born in Germany in 1962, Walter and his brother Carl were brought to the United States by their mother at a very young age. Their father, an American soldier, had abandoned the family shortly after the two children were born. Their mother, a single German woman, struggled to raise her two sons in a foreign society. These two life paths intersected on one fateful day. Kenneth Hartsock walked into the bank like any other normal Thursday morning, unaware it would be the last day of his life. Walter LaGrand woke up in a shabby rented room, planning the robbery he thought would solve all his financial problems. But there was a detail about Kenneth Hartsock that not even his family knew until after his death. He had been secretly saving money for 10 years to buy a small truck and open a repair shop after retirement. This savings book was found in his desk drawer with the words, "For Martha's future," his wife's name. Walter LaGrand was born into a broken family, but his first few months in Germany were relatively peaceful. His mother, Augusta, was a young woman who fell in love with an American soldier stationed in Germany. When Walter was 5, the family immigrated to Arizona with hopes of a better life. But the American dream quickly turned into a nightmare when the father abandoned the family. According to criminal psychologists, the absence of a father figure during a crucial stage severely affected Walter's development. Combined with the pressure of cultural integration and economic hardship, Walter began to engage in unlawful behavior from a very early age. Looking at Walter's developmental timeline, we can clearly see the process of escalation. In 1975, at age 13, Walter was first arrested for petty theft. In 1977, at 15, he was sent to a juvenile detention center for theft. In 1980, at 18, he and his brother Carl committed their first robbery. In 1982, at 20, the bank robbery led to the crime of murder. On the morning of January 7, 1982, the Arizona air was dry and cold. Walter LaGrand woke up in the small, dirty rented room he shared with his brother Carl. They had been planning to rob the Valley National Bank in Marana for weeks. The initial plan was simple: enter the bank, threaten the employees, take the money, and run. Neither of them predicted how far things would go. Kenneth Hartsock arrived at the bank as usual at 7 a.m. He checked the security system and prepared the cash for a new workday. Dawn Lopez, 20, was also at the bank early to prepare for her shift. Neither knew they were stepping into one of the most terrifying days of their lives. Although Walter felt anxious and uneasy, he was determined. He needed money to pay off debts and thought a quick robbery would solve everything. Carl, the older brother, appeared calmer but was also full of tension. They brought box cutters, initially just for intimidation. Witnesses described the two brothers entering the bank at 9:30 a.m. They wore bandanas over their faces and shouted for everyone to get on the floor. Kenneth Hartsock, with 20 years of banking experience, tried to comply to protect the other employees. But as he moved slowly to open the safe, Walter became agitated and aggressive. The Hartsock family at home, preparing for a normal day, had no idea their loved one was in danger. Kenneth's wife, Martha, was preparing lunch as usual, thinking her husband would be home at 6 p.m., as always. The investigation began just minutes after the robbery ended. Police arrived at the scene at 9:45 a.m., only 15 minutes after receiving the report. The scene was bloody, with Kenneth Hartsock lying in a pool of blood, having been stabbed 24 times with a box cutter. Dawn Lopez was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Investigative technology in 1982 was limited, but investigators quickly gathered crucial evidence. Fingerprints on the counter, the perpetrator's blood on the floor, and most importantly, the testimony of Dawn Lopez. She had recognized the voice of one of the two criminals, a voice with a slight German accent. Crime scene investigation methods in 1982 relied mainly on collecting physical evidence and witness testimony. There was no DNA testing, no modern surveillance cameras. But investigators found a crucial clue, a red Chevrolet seen by a witness leaving the bank. Every piece of evidence pointed to one conclusion. The fingerprints matched the criminal records of the LaGrand brothers. Dawn Lopez's testimony confirmed there were two male perpetrators. The red car was found abandoned just 2 miles from the bank. Most importantly, the words, "Just make sure he's dead," were clearly heard by Dawn Lopez. But investigators did not know that Walter LaGrand had returned home and recounted the entire event to his girlfriend. This woman later became a key witness in the trial, providing details that only the perpetrator would know. The manhunt for the LaGrand brothers took place over 48 tense hours. They didn't run far but hid in cheap motels around Phoenix. Their escape plan was extremely amateurish, simply driving south with the hope of crossing the Mexican border. Walter's time on the run was described as a series of days filled with paranoia and anxiety. He constantly changed locations, avoided crowded areas, and lived mainly on the cash from the robbery. Carl appeared calmer, but was also very tense. The cooperation between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies created a tight dragnet. The FBI was brought in due to the severity of the crime. Border Patrol was notified to prevent them from crossing the border. There were 3 times Walter LaGrand was nearly caught in those 48 hours. The first time, a traffic cop stopped the car they were driving but didn't recognize them because the information hadn't been updated. The second time, they were in a motel that police searched just 2 hours after they had left. The third time, a citizen reported 2 suspicious men at a gas station, but by the time police arrived, they were gone. Finally, the arrest took place on the morning of January 9, 1982, at a cheap motel south of Phoenix. A motel employee recognized them from the description on TV and called the police. When the police arrived, both surrendered without resistance. The trial of Walter LaGrand began in October 1982, just 9 months after the crime. It was one of the most closely watched trials in Arizona that year. The Pima County Courthouse became the center of attention, with many reporters and citizens present. The prosecution's strategy was clear: to prove this was a premeditated murder during the commission of another felony. They relied on the testimony of Dawn Lopez's physical evidence and, most importantly, the statement, "Just make sure he's dead," to prove intent and brutality. The defense tried to argue that this was a robbery gone wrong, not a planned murder. They emphasized their client's youth, difficult upbringing, and unstable mental state. However, the fact that Kenneth Hartsock was stabbed 24 times severely weakened this argument. In Arizona, law first-degree murder requires proof of premeditation and deliberation. Walter's statement, "Just make sure he's dead," provided clear evidence of both elements. The prosecution argued that this was not a spontaneous act, but a calculated decision. The defense's strategy focused on mitigating the punishment rather than denying guilt. They brought witnesses to testify about Walter's difficult circumstances, the absence of a father, and the pressures of being an immigrant. However, Walter's prior record of robbery and theft was used by the prosecution to demonstrate a pattern of criminal behavior. There was a crucial point in the trial that many people didn't know. Walter LaGrand actually wanted to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. But his lawyer advised him to reject this deal, hoping to win a lighter sentence. This decision ultimately led to Walter receiving the death penalty. The trial lasted 3 weeks with many key witnesses. Dawn Lopez appeared in court and recounted the entire event in detail. Her testimony had a powerful impact on the jury. The family of Kenneth Hartsock was also present and described the kind man they had lost. On November 15, 1982, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict for first-degree murder. A week later, during the sentencing phase, they recommended the death penalty for both Walter and Carl LaGrand. The judge accepted this recommendation. In the years after his conviction, Walter LaGrand wrote many letters from prison. These letters were later published and revealed his complex state of mind. In some letters, he expressed deep remorse for his actions. In others, he felt he was treated unfairly by the legal system. Forensic linguistic analysis of these letters shows that Walter had a tendency to shift responsibility and rationalize his actions. He often used passive language and avoided taking direct responsibility. However, there were also passages that showed sincere remorse, especially regarding the death of Kenneth Hartsock. When comparing the timeline of these confessions with the evidence in the case file, there are many notable similarities. Walter described in detail the feeling of panic as the situation spiraled out of control. He also admitted to saying, "Just make sure he's dead," but claimed it was just something said in a moment of agitation. Walter LaGrand's final 24 hours began on March 13, 1999. After 17 years on death row, the final execution day had arrived. Guards described Walter as relatively calm, showing no signs of panic or attempting suicide like some other death row inmates. Walter's final activities included a phone call with his mother in Germany, who cried throughout the 30-minute conversation. He also wrote a final letter to his ex-girlfriend, in which he apologized for everything that had happened. The prison chaplain spent time with Walter, describing him as a man who had accepted his fate. Walter's mood was noted by the guards as resigned, accepting but not desperate. He spent most of his time reading and writing in the diary he had kept for the last years of his life. A final psychological evaluation showed that Walter had reached a certain state of calm after years of psychological struggle. Walter LaGrand's last meal became one of the most famous in the history of death row. He requested 6 BBQ beef ribs, 1 large T-bone steak, 2 cheeseburgers with bacon, 1 large order of French fries, 4 cans of Coca-Cola, 1 vanilla milkshake, 1 pint of strawberry ice cream, and some assorted candies. The meal was served at 4 p.m. on March 2nd, about 18 hours before the execution. Walter ate slowly and seemed to savor every bite. Guards described him eating like a normal man, enjoying a good meal with no signs of anxiety or haste. The sheer volume of food surprised many. It was almost a mini feast. Many observers believe this was not just about eating his fill, but was also a silent statement. The choice of typical American foods could reflect the complexity of Walter's identity, a German who had lived in the U.S. for almost his entire life. On the morning of March 3, 1999, Walter LaGrand was taken to the execution chamber at 9 a.m. Arizona's gas chamber was a small room with a metal chair in the center, surrounded by thick glass windows for witnesses to observe. In the room were the warden, a chaplain, a doctor, and witnesses, including representatives of the victim's family and reporters. Walter was asked for his last words. He looked through the glass window and said, "I love you all." This statement surprised many witnesses. A man who had brutally killed Kenneth Hartsock was now speaking of love in his final moments. Psychological analysis of this final statement shows a deep paradox. Walter may have been trying to express remorse, or it was his way of seeking forgiveness from those who had witnessed his life. However, some analysts suggest it could have been a final manipulative act. The impact of these words on the witnesses and the victim's family was varied. Some felt confused by the contrast between his past brutal actions and this seemingly sincere statement. The family of Kenneth Hartsock present in the execution chamber described a complex feeling, both angry and sad. The gas execution process began at 9:10 a.m. Walter was strapped into the metal chair, and sodium cyanide pellets were dropped into a vessel of sulfuric acid beneath the chair. Hydrogen cyanide gas began to fill the chamber, and Walter was instructed to breathe deeply to make the process quick. However, Walter did not follow the instructions. He tried to hold his breath and refused to inhale deeply, causing the process to be painfully prolonged. For nearly 10 minutes, witnesses watched Walter convulse, gasp, and appear to be in agony. The sight made many present feel uneasy and question the humanity of this execution method. A doctor pronounced Walter LaGrand dead at 9:18 a.m. on March 3, 1999. His death marked one of the last times Arizona used the gas chamber. The brutality of the method, especially in Walter's case, pushed many states to switch to lethal injection. The immediate reaction from witnesses was diverse. The family of Kenneth Hartsock felt justice had been served, but were also haunted by the painful scene. The reporters present described it as one of the most disturbing sights they had ever witnessed. The international media, especially from Germany, reported extensively on this brutal death. With the death of Walter LaGrand, the final chapter of a 17-year-long case was closed. But the aftermath of this event would last for many years, creating significant changes in diplomatic relations and the justice system. The family of Kenneth Hartsock, after years of fighting for justice, finally saw it served. Martha Hartsock, the victim's wife, lived for another 15 years after her husband's death before passing away in 2014. She spent much of her remaining time advocating for the rights of crime victims. The diplomatic crisis between Germany and the United States did not end with Walter's death. On June 27, 2001, the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of Germany, confirming that the United States had violated the Vienna Convention by failing to inform the German consulate of the arrest of their citizens. This ruling brought about significant changes in U.S. legal procedures. Law enforcement agencies are now required to notify consulates when they arrest foreign nationals. This has been called the LaGrand Protocol, an unwanted but important legacy of the case. Unresolved elements still exist today. There is evidence to suggest that Walter and Carl may have committed other crimes before the 1982 bank robbery, but these cases were never fully investigated. Some victims of unsolved robberies in Arizona still hope to find answers. For those interested in the Walter LaGrand case or with information about unsolved crimes in Arizona during the 1980-1982 period, the Arizona Department of Public Safety still accepts information. Hotline 1-877-272-TIPS. The story of Walter LaGrand has left many important lessons. Judicially, it changed how the U.S. treats arrested foreign nationals. Humanely, it contributed to the elimination of cruel execution methods. Diplomatically, it showed the importance of adhering to international treaties. From an immigrant German child to an internationally controversial death row, inmate Walter LaGrand became a symbol of many complex issues in the modern justice system. His lavish last meal, his final words, "I love you all," and his painful death in the gas chamber have become haunting images in the history of American crime. The death of Walter LaGrand was not merely the execution of a sentence. It became a watershed moment in the history of justice diplomacy and human rights. This case continues to be studied in law schools, discussed in diplomatic conferences, and remembered as a reminder of the importance of balancing justice and humanity. Today, looking back at the Walter LaGrand case, we can clearly see the changes that have taken place over the past 25 years. Arizona has stopped using the gas chamber, consular rights are better protected, and German-U.S. relations have overcome this crisis to become stronger. But the questions about justice, forgiveness, and the price of crime remain as relevant as ever. Walter LaGrand paid for his crime with his life, but his legacy continues to influence the justice and diplomatic systems to this day. In his final moments, when Walter LaGrand said, "I love you all," perhaps he was trying to find some redemption. Whether these words were sincere or not, they have become part of a larger story about crime punishment and the hope for humanity's ultimate salvation.